Mount Blade Warband is an action RPG strategy fantasy game, and fantasy really is the key word here, developed by Tailworlds Entertainment. It was released over a decade ago to critical acclaim. Though, if you're watching this video, you're probably already familiar with Warband. Now today we're going to be analysing Mount Blade Warband from a perspective of historical realism. Not necessarily historical accuracy, as Tailworlds had never intended for this to be an historically accurate game. It is a fantasy game set in the fictional land of Calradia. However, its factions, societal systems, castles, combat, weapons and armour are all based on real medieval history. Tailworlds themselves outline this point in their official player manual. They state, Calradia is a medieval agricultural society whose technology is roughly equivalent to that of the period of around 1150 to 1350 AD in Europe and Asia. The economy is driven almost entirely by human and animal power. There is no magic known to Calradians other than that of legend and folklore, which has no impact on actual gameplay. So what we're dealing with here is a game grounded in actual medieval history, between the years 1150 to 1350 AD, and I want to state from the beginning that despite Warband being a fantasy game, it depicts medieval society to a greater degree of realism than most games. So, without further delay, let's get into the historical analysis of Mount Blade Warband. Now, we're going to be starting with one of my favourite topics, and that is architecture, primarily focusing on castle design. Now, in Mount Blade Warband, there are three main types of settlements, which all have unique, let's say, pros to the way they're designed, but also some serious negatives as well, and we will address all of those. And those three settlement types are towns, castles, and villages. They vary in exactly what's contained in them, depending on what specific region of the map you're in, what specific culture or kingdom you're looking at, but they do have a general design theme that we can follow through, and we'll look at a few case examples from different factions. Now, we are looking here not necessarily for accuracy, but rather for realism and practicality. So we've already established the era in which they had technology between 1150 and 1350 AD. Would it be practical and realistic for people with that level of technology to build various structures in this game that we're going to look at? And also, are they designed practically? So are they designed actually with defense in mind? Are the castles well designed? All of these different topics we're going to look at. Now, I'd just like to quickly thank the Mount Blade subreddit community, who were enormously helpful in providing sources and information regarding this topic. So we're going to start by looking at Praven, which is a large town. I believe it's the capital city of the Kingdom of Swadia, and it has several key elements that I think are important to look at. Now, right here from the outside of Praven Castle, we already see something awesome that is a detail that not a lot of castles get right in video games, and that is properly sized merlons. So we'll just zoom in here and you can see those merlons. They're the right height. They're to protect the archer standing on the walls from incoming fire, and also so they can fire through. And you'll see there on that merlon there are arrow loops, which is a rare detail. This is a real life thing that would be included on a castle, as these arrow loops allow for the defending archer to fire through the merlon with great ease. Now, as we head towards the castle, you'll see here this large gate with a portcullis on it. Now, that might seem like a small detail, but you'll see that many fantasy castles and video games don't even include that, and this does look realistic. I look up here and I can't actually see whether the portcullis leads to a windlass, which is the winch system they would use to raise the portcullis. Whether that detail's there or not on this town, I'm not sure. I couldn't find a way to look up there. Now, this is less of a note on realism and more of a point regarding common design, practicality, and what actually would have been done to make this castle more defendable. Now, you'll see here that as we approach into this gateway, there is no murder holes above on the roof, and those were holes where essentially people, defenders standing above, could throw different things down, whether that be hot oil, rocks, even shooting arrows down, whatever the purpose is. And the way this system operated is you would then have a second gate on the internal side of this entryway, which would stop the attackers. So even once they get past the first portcullis, there would be a second one which would keep them trapped in this area. Now, curiously enough, on this castle, there is no second portcullis, despite there being room for it. And what makes this even more odd is this next detail. Now, despite there being no murder holes, there are internal arrow loops. I mean, this is an incredible detail, the fact that these are actually included, and we can walk behind and actually enter here in the game and have a look. Now, they are thicker than real arrow loops would have been, but I have to say that I actually commend that decision by Tailworlds, as it allows the player in a video game to more easily shoot through them. So from a gameplay standpoint, I actually think it would have been a detriment to the historical realism if they weren't usable, and the fact that they're a little bit thicker means that I assume at least that they are actually usable in-game. Now, as we continue to walk through this pathway here, you'll see that there's continuing arrow loops across there, which just makes the decision not to include a second portcullis seem honestly quite bizarre to me, as it would have allowed for an incredible level of defense in that area. Now, we'll just walk here through the side, and you can see the way these arrow loops are designed. It really is actually a wonderful design, and it's very realistic. And it just keeps getting better here. You can see as we look at these arrow loops that the wall actually angles to a point, just like in real life. And essentially what that allows the defending archer to do is angle their shots from different perspectives there, allowing them to have a greater shot on the enemies running through the various areas that they could be defending. Obviously, the ability of these arrow loops to actually cause damage is diminished by the fact that there is no second portcullis, but what can you do? It's still an incredible design, and very, very realistic. Now, as we walk through the city here, what you'll see is things such as these internal divisions, these walls where there is room for a gate or a portcullis, but there's nothing there. And the reason cities had these, and why they would have a portcullis or a gate or something to block that pathway, is it meant that even if the attacker took over a portion of the city, they couldn't then go on to take over the entire city. There were several layers of defense. Now, props to this city for having internal divisions like that. However, there is no portcullis, so there's not really anywhere to defend it. Really, it just would serve as creating a choke point for easier defense, but I think it would be another missed opportunity here. Now, judging actual building and building techniques is a little bit more difficult because it doesn't necessarily have to adhere to historical accuracy as long as it's realistic within the bounds of what technology could build for the time of which this game is set. Now, luckily enough for us, they are using actual medieval building designs here. What we have here is the common medieval building technique known as jettying. Essentially, it's when the upper floor extends beyond the lower floor. It was common in medieval cities for the purpose of extra floor space while still maintaining the wide street sizes. This is seen here in the city of Praven and across various cities in Calradia, and it absolutely adheres to realism, and it makes practical sense as to why they would use this building technique. And now we get to some of the problems that this city has. Now, mainly they're mistakes that the developers made, and you have to forgive the developers here because this was a smaller budget game, and it's a game that came out quite a while ago. And I think despite glitches here, like where you can see the wall doesn't meet, I still believe that this city is truly incredibly designed, given the time in which the game came out, being over a decade ago, I believe 12 years ago now. And the fact that this was not a AAA game by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I just have to show this detail because I missed it on my first walkthrough of Praven, but as we approach the gate here, you can see up at the top there, those are machiculations, which is an incredible detail, very rarely something that would be added in this game. You can see it's essentially where there's that similar jettying style, where the top goes further out than the bottom layer there, and you can see there's arrow slits there. Now, I thought the arrow loops were an impressive level of detail, but actual machiculations on the wall there, that is incredible. It allows the defenders to shoot arrows directly down to where the portcullis there is being sieged. An incredible level of detail, not something we would regularly see in a video game. Even in many modern recreations of castles, you wouldn't see that sort of detail. So there you have it, there's Praven. It's a great level of historical realism. Obviously there are problems with the design, but there's nothing unbelievable here, there's nothing fantastical. It is all very much grounded in reality, in historical realism. This is truly impressive stuff, especially when you consider that this game is over a decade old, and the fact that it was developed on a smaller budget. The level of detail they managed to cram in here is truly commendable. And next up we're going to be looking at a castle. That castle is Ribilet Castle. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. It's another castle close by to Praven so that we could keep a similar architectural style so we can compare and contrast what this castle does right. Is it a good castle? Is it a bad castle? We'll see. Now, the first problem I see is from the perspective of how easy it is to actually defend a castle like this. What's the practicality of defending a castle like this? And if you look at a bird's eye map of the castle, there are no internal divisions. There is the single bailey, and then nothing else. So once you've breached the gates, you're at the keep. There's nothing in between. That is, however, a point less about historical accuracy and more about the practicality of defending a castle like this. Now, as we enter the gatehouse here, you'll see that there is a portcullis and there is a wooden door here. However, in a similar sense to the town of Praven, this castle does not have any murder holes, and even worse, it doesn't even have any arrow slits or anything like that on the side there. It does seriously diminish, I believe, its defensive capabilities. However, it does get better, as we have in the gatehouse above that portcullis a proper windlass, a proper winch system in order to raise and lower that portcullis. An awesome detail. I'm not entirely certain about how accurate this is as a windlass. It's very much beyond my realm of knowledge, but I'll put a picture up to compare to a real windlass. As we move on here, you'll also see that there are no machiculations, so there's no overhang there in which an archer could fire down. There are these two potentially arrow loops, but they're too high to actually be able to be fired out of. I would say they more are windows rather than arrow loops, and that is a shame here. You can see that they're simply too high for an archer to be able to fire at. Still, I think this is a step up above Praven, as this is actually an accessible gatehouse. And we'll head on to the battlements now. Here you can see there are proper merlons of a proper height here. They go all the way above our head, which means that the person standing behind them is completely covered from any potential incoming fire. Great detail, something we would rarely see in games. Often they're depicted at a much lower height, which is completely inaccurate. And also a fairly thick wall here, which also, you could fit several men abreast on this wall. And obviously some walls would be thicker, but I think that this is fair enough considering how thin some walls are in video games. Again, you can see these merlons here, the perfect height in order to defend someone. Sadly, there's no machiculations, again, which I think is a missed opportunity on a castle like this. It's not really a point on historical accuracy. However, including those machiculations would add an extra level of defense to this castle. And as we enter the room here that's sort of connected to the battlements, you can see just the wonderful design of this roof here, and something that looks like, to me at least, that it could have absolutely existed when you compare it to actual medieval structures, and furthermore, more arrow slits in this building. Once again, an awesome attention to detail, and I cannot stress enough how impressive some of this game's architecture is, considering how old this game is, frankly, and the fact that there are games like, the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which have massive budgets, they're massive scale open world games. I think Skyrim came out a year after this game, yet I don't think Skyrim has anything on some of the structures in Mount Blade Warband. And I'll conclude here at Ribulet Castle just by looking at the interior of this keep, and I can't really speak to how historically accurate something like this is. I'm not entirely certain something like this could be built. I'll try and find some comparison images, but truly marvellous architecture, and from the standpoint of a fantasy game, this stuff just looks awesome. And I'll just point out some of the things that the good people over at the Mount Blade subreddit commented on, and that was, well, firstly, it was the fact that the castles in Mount Blade Warband are often quite barren. They're just by themselves, and while there were certainly castles in the Middle Ages that were just in solitary areas with no life around them, often a castle was at the centre of a town or a village, and industry and commerce and all these sort of things popped up around medieval castles, and that isn't necessarily represented in the castles of Mount Blade Warband. They're often quite barren. And then the other point that was made was the placement of a lot of these castles. When you look on the map, they're sort of evenly spread all over the map, when in reality it was pointed out to me that castles often served, their placements at least served strategic purposes to defend certain areas. There's no reason to have a castle on the far side of the map, far away from where anything is. As far as castles as defensive structures, they were primarily built along borders with other kingdoms for obvious purposes, and I don't necessarily think I should say from a gameplay standpoint, I understand why they're spread out in this way, but I do think for an added level of historical believability and realism, they could have had a greater concentration of castles in areas that made sense strategically. And next we'll just quickly touch on some of the combat mechanics. Now, Skallagrim, another YouTube channel, made a much better video on this than I will ever be able to do. He's an expert, clearly, in historical European martial arts. I've only dabbled in it. I'm certainly out of my depth on this topic. So I definitely recommend you check out his video. But to summarize some of my own observations, some of his points as well, is the movement fundamentally is realistic. It is grounded in the way an actual human moves in this game. There's no one, doing backflips or anything like that, like you would see in other video games. So in that sense, it is realistic. Some of the problems are the fact that it's a bit more clunky, and there was a great comment left on that video, the aforementioned video, by Tailworlds, and they were essentially talking about having to strike a balance between a game that is enjoyable to play and also the realism. And the result of that is combat that can seem kind of clunky, and I think that is fair enough considering the age of the game. I will say I'm not entirely certain Bannerlord addresses that perfectly. And you will still see here, we're looking at some multiplayer footage, there are still people doing some sort of unrealistic jumping around, but I think overall it feels good enough, I think. Some of the problems come, I think, more when you're talking about larger scale battles with lots of people, where it can get even more clunky, as opposed to these one-on-one duels that we're witnessing here. The other issues, I think, definitely stem from the way armor works in this game. The fact that you're not obviously targeting a specific point of the body. In a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance, there are very much weak spots where you target. That is not necessarily portrayed here. There just seems to be a general damage, and I think a lot of the armor, and we'll talk about armor later on, but the armor often doesn't feel like it's doing much protection. Like a sword can slash through plate armor in many cases. Then there's the admission of the diagonal strike, which is the most commonly used strike in medieval sword fighting, as opposed to Warband, where we just have horizontal and vertical strikes. That diagonal strike, rather, oh my goodness, I'm trying to find my words, that diagonal strike is not represented in Warband. But overall, I think it's a good combat system, especially considering the age of the game. And then we get to some of the actual battles, and I think a key issue that they suffer from is probably their scale. I mean, when you look at real-life medieval combat, you're talking about thousands and thousands of troops on a battlefield, and games like Kingdom Come Deliverance suffer from this problem of a much smaller scale as well. However, I think that in the context of a game like Warband, it makes sense, and I think it's probably a good decision that the combat is a little bit smaller scale. It makes sense so it can, run more smoothly. I think Bannerlord addresses this issue somewhat. The battles become a little bit larger, but obviously nowhere near the extent that you'd need to make it realistic. If you really want that sort of large scale, I'd recommend playing a game like Total War, which I love the Total War games as well. I think they're great games, but it is sort of a different thing, and Warband really represents that up close and personal sort of combat. Now, the AI in this game is awful. So from that standpoint, the tactics you're going to see from the AI are going to be pretty bad. But you do have a series of tools to your disposal through the function key commands, where you can order your troops to hold a certain position, you can change their formation, get them to march forward or follow you or charge or whatever it may be. You have all of those tools to your disposal, and you can do with them what you wish. So if you choose to try and recreate an actual medieval tactic on the battlefield, you're welcome to do that. And this game has the ability to allow you to do that. Now, the other issue I will point out is sieges. Sieges in this game are awful. I think they're probably the worst part of the combat. Everything from the way the siege engines operate to how everyone's, stuck on the ladders, or it's terrible, frankly. But you know what? Overall, I still think that the battles in this game are incredibly enjoyable. Not so much the sieges, but the open field battles are very enjoyable. And you can take them seriously to a level of I think, quite impressive immersion and recreation of actual medieval tactics and warfare, and this game does that well. And I'll just make a few notes here on the fact that this game is often described as a feudal simulator, and I think it does do that aspect really well. If you're looking for a game that truly simulates the sort of the politics of medieval history in the way that a lot of the nation wasn't quite a sort of, this is the point here, is the king, and this is represented in Warband, the king isn't necessarily, I mean, they're the most powerful person in the kingdom, let's say, but their power is really reliant on the support of the vassals, the individual lords who, control parts of the land, and there is no standing army, for instance. You'll remember in Game of Thrones, if you've watched that show, King Joffrey ranting about how he wants a standing army, and he doesn't think that there should be individual bannermen who all come together in times of war. And this was a real thing in the Middle Ages. There was no centralized standing army, and Warband portrays that and recreates that beautifully. You have the fact that the king's power is reliant on his vassals. And then you also have other sort of societal systems which it portrays, whether that be the role of women in medieval society very much as second-class citizens. And I like the fact that the game doesn't shy away from trying to represent that. You can still play as a woman in this game, but your life is going to be, inexorably more difficult than if you played a man. And I think some people would want to shy away from that. A lot of games would want to shy away from that. But I think not sugarcoating medieval history as being the sort of egalitarian utopia is a much better decision. Actually portraying medieval society for what it was, which was a deeply flawed system. Now, there are some issues you could make an argument about, like the levels of class mobility in Warband. If you're a nameless, peasant from the middle of nowhere, lords are going to look down at you at first, but you can slowly build up this reputation to where eventually you're the king of Calradia. You've united the entire kingdom, and this rarely happened in the Middle Ages. I think there is a level of class mobility in Warband which isn't necessarily realistic, but from the standpoint of a game, I think it obviously makes sense. But overall, from the perspective of, is Mount Blade Warband a good feudal simulator? Does it represent the feudal system accurately? I would say absolutely. Obviously, it's a fictionalized world, and it's a generalization. It's an anachronism of different time periods coming together. But overall, as a generalization of the medieval feudal system, this does it perfectly. And the next topic, and I think this is a topic that gets talked a lot about in the context of Mount Blade Warband, and that's the various historical influences for each of the game's factions. Now, obviously, there's a lot of anachronism going on. We're talking about various times and places, and they're all sort of then merged into this one world. And some of it is pure fiction and totally invented by the game, but a lot of it is drawn from actual historical influence. And the first faction we'll be discussing is the Saranid Sultanate. Now, I think a lot of people have mixed feelings about this faction. I certainly don't think that they're the best faction in the context of the game, but they do have a lot of very interesting historical influences. Now, I think most people would automatically assume that they're based on sort of Islamic Arabia during the Middle Ages. However, I think that, you can look at their name, for instance, the Saranids, that is a name that draws influence, obviously, from the Persian Sassanids. Now, it's not a one-to-one comparison there. Obviously, there are various influences. I also think that when you look at their troop types, particularly their flagship troop, the Mamluk, that is absolutely an influence from the Muslim world. The Mamluks, for instance, were essentially non-Muslim or non-Arab even slaves who fought in the ranks of these various Arab dynasties, and that is sort of their flagship troop. And then there's the other part of the Saranid name. So the Saranid comes from the Sassanid, but the Sultanate refers to the Sultan, the leader, and you also have emirs in this, and that is very much a term that comes from the Muslim world, whereas the Sassanids would have a different term for their leaders. And then we have the Swadians, or the Swadians, probably one of the most controversial factions as far as trying to figure out what exactly its historical influence comes from. Now, I think that there's almost no debate that the terms, or the name rather, Swadia, comes from the German Swabia, which was a duchy in the Holy Roman Empire, and they were very much known for their sort of heavy cavalry and their lancers, sort of similar to the Swadian Knights, which are the sort of the premier troop of the Swadian forces in Mount Blade Warband. Now, I think that more broadly they're a generalization of Western European kingdoms and regions from the Middle Ages. However, I think they have a main focus on the Germans and the French. There is certainly a lot of French parallels and crossover there in the armour, and that certainly shines through. However, I would certainly argue that German is probably the primary influence, and particularly that Swabian faction. And then we have the Rhodoks, my personal favourite faction. I simply love them as a faction. They obviously have some handicaps. The fact that they have no cavalry, for instance, I think is a bit absurd. And especially when you consider their primary influence. So most people will just point generally to Italy when talking about the Rhodoks, but I think they definitely focus more on northern Italy, with even an emphasis on, I would say, medieval Venice and the Venetian styles of troops, particularly their crossbowmen and their parvies. Crossbowmen, you see those big shields that the sharpshooters have and the sergeants, the Rhodoks sergeants have. These massive shields, the parvies shields. Now, they don't use them quite the same way in Mount Blade Warband. Traditionally, these would be planted in the ground to essentially create a barricade from which a crossbowman could fire behind. So that doesn't quite happen in Mount Blade Warband, but it's not really a point on historical accuracy, but you could say in real life that is certainly how it would be done. Now, the other thing is obviously their use of spearmen, and that is very much an influence, again, from that northern Italian, a lot of the Swiss influence as well. When you look at the map, when you look at the mountainous region, it very much sort of screams Swiss Alps. And the fact that they don't have cavalry, despite the fact that the Italians were, had wonderful cavalry for most of the Middle Ages and most of the regions, the fact that that's not included, I would say it's more of a gamified sort of reason. I would like to see some cavalry from the Rhodoks. I think Rhodok cavalry would have actually been a really interesting addition, but sadly it's not here. And then we have the Nords. Nord literally meaning north. So we're talking about, the Nordic countries, like the Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these sort of countries. They very much have that Vikinger influence in them. Their round shields, their axes, their use of javelins, which is a weapon that was actually regularly used by these peoples. And particularly, I think Mount Blade Warband, and this is sort of interesting, has had such an influence on the world's perception and pop culture's perception of Nordic history. When you look up image of Vikings or artwork of Vikings, one of the first pictures that comes up is the artwork from Mount Blade Warband. You always see it used in reference. So I think it's actually had quite a large cultural influence. And obviously they use terms like Jarl, which was quite literally a chief in these Nordic societies. Once again, it's a bit anachronistic because you have, Vikings existing when, certain factions like, let's say the Swabians shouldn't necessarily exist. And obviously there's that crossover there. But overall, I think it's a really interesting faction. And it definitely raises the question, what if the Vikings had continued to evolve into a new form, a more sort of, medieval 13th century sort of form. And that's sort of what you see here. And it is quite interesting. And here we have the Khergit Khanate, particularly known for their horse lancers, their Khergit lancers, and their horse archers. Very much a powerful force to be reckoned with in the world of Mount Blade Warband. And the obvious thing that comes to mind is the Mongolians, as far as a historical influence. But obviously the Mongolians were part of a broader thing. We're talking about steppe culture more broadly. And that is very much where their influence comes from their emphasis on where they're placed in the world, literally in steppes in Mount Blade Warband's Calradia, and also in their armour and their weapons, and all sorts of things like that. Now, there is also in their armour, I think there's a Turkish influence, you could sort of argue. You see that, and it sort of makes sense, I suppose, when you look at history. But also, I do remember, years ago I read something from the developer, because I know Tailworlds is a Turkish developer, something about how the Khergits had a particular Turkish influence in them as well. I couldn't find that, but I certainly do see that now looking at it. Now, for instance, the Khanate of the name Khergit Khanate, comes from the idea of a region ruled by a Khan, who was a ruler in the steppes, further enforcing that sort of steppe influence. And last but not least, we have the Vaegirs, who sort of like the Swadians are a culmination of a region of Europe, in this case, rather than Western Europe, very much Eastern Europe. Now, they obviously have that particular emphasis on Russian influence. You can just look at the climate of where the Vaegirs are set in the sort of the snowy highlands there. very similar to Russia in that sense, and their armour as well, but I think there is certainly influence from other Eastern European countries, and interestingly enough, there is a Mongolian influence in a lot of their armour as well, and that makes sense when you're talking about a post-Mongol Russia in real life, and that influence does definitely shine through in a lot of Mongolian troop types. Now, they have all sorts of things. Once again, they're very broad, like the Swadians. They have, you know, lots of things, but rather than crossbows, they've got archers in this case. But they've got their own knights and footmen and ranged troops, and they're a very broad faction. But yes, they are definitely based on the Russians. For instance, they also call their leaders a boyar, which was a term for nobility used by the Russians and other Slavic groups, and I think that is definitely emblematic of the faction more broadly. Now, I'll just finish off by touching on some of the armour in this game and talking about that. Now, this was one of the topics where I discussed with the Mount Blade subreddit for different sort of information on it. I think the general consensus was that yes, the armour in Mount Blade Warband, from a perspective of how it visually looks, is realistic. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it functions in a way that's realistic. So, for instance, earlier I talked about how the fact that the armour really doesn't feel like it provides much protection. You can be in full plate armour and then be hit with a sword, and that can just cut straight through you, and you can do that to other characters too. And that is simply just not realistic. You know, when you're in a full suit of plate armor, you're a bit like a tank. You know, you're aiming for weak spots and slowly chipping away at people's health. You can't just slice through plate armor. It doesn't happen. Now, blunt weapons, that's a little bit different. But as far as, you know, exactly how it functions all the time in battles, it just simply isn't realistic. But from a perspective of how it looks, it is realistic. Not necessarily all of it is based exactly one-to-one on a real-life piece of armor. There is certainly some fictionalization of the armor, but that doesn't matter. That's sort of part of this game. It is a fantasy game. It is a fictional world, so it doesn't all have to be perfectly realistic. And this whole issue of armor not exactly acting like how it would in real life, well, that's just an issue emblematic of the fact that the minute you add in a system of this armor provides this sort of level of protection on a stat basis, you know, all of the realism goes out the window, because that's obviously not how armor works in real life. There isn't a series of stats attached to your armor. Now, there are some, you know, pieces of armor where you just sort of facepalm, you know, when you see things like studded leather, which sadly does make an appearance in Mount Blade Warband, sort of armor that never really existed and doesn't make sense. It isn't practical, but you know what? It's not impossible. It could have been made, and this isn't real life, so therefore I think that it gets a pass. Now, that was one hell of a long video. If you've made it this far, congratulations and thank you for giving this video your time and attention. I certainly enjoyed making it. Now, obviously, I'm not a historian. I'm just an enthusiast about medieval history, but even that I think is sort of pushing it. Really, I'm just a layman when it comes to all of this. So, you know, take everything I say with a grain of salt. You can do your own research, and I'd love to see in the comments section a discussion about what I got right, what I got wrong, and different people's opinions on different things, because that's important. And at any rate, it's all about having fun here. I enjoy Mount Blade Warband. I enjoy medieval history. I think that's all that matters. Now, I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video, and I'd also like to thank the people on the Mount Blade subreddit community who helped put this video together by providing some of their own knowledge and time in writing different pieces for me to draw inspiration on. And in the description, I will include a link to all of those videos I mentioned, as well as the background music which has been playing throughout this entire video. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe. That would all mean a lot. Thank you, and have a good day.